years. I've seen a lot of battles. I've got some scars, some wounds, some memories that I wish I could let go of. I've seen a lot of needless battles. I've seen people win battles and then lose the war. But this is nothing new among Christians. It actually started with the church in the late first century, and it's been going on ever since. In fact, I think it's a safe thing to say that most often we are our own worst enemy. Perhaps that's a little too harsh, but I think it applies in most cases, and we have fought over some of the silliest things. In 1857, for example, a book came out called Umphilus, which is Latin for belly button, and it was an entire book written over the question, did Adam have a belly button? And let me tell you, I have heard much worse than this when it comes to brothers and sisters and the fights and the squabbles and the splits that we get into. I have a great deal of trepidation as to what's coming to the church in the next few years. In fact, in some places, it's already here, and it has to do with the question of how old is planet Earth. Now, that's what today's lesson is going to deal with. I believe that the serpent is still among us and probably more active today than ever before. And of course, the serpent represents Satan. Scripture is clear that Satan is the author of confusion, and that confusion often leads to division and to strife. And here's what I want you to think about as we begin. Just as Satan was there in the garden, creating division between Adam and Eve, division between God and Adam and Eve, division between holiness and unholiness. Just as all of that confusion and division was occurring, so it is today. And oddly enough, it's about a subject that none of us can empirically answer. I was not there when God created the earth, and neither were you. None of us have any first-hand sight evidence of how this happened. Yet today we have churches that won't allow certain Christians to place membership if they believe differently from them on the question of how old is the earth. So I'm just going to come right out and say it. It really doesn't make a whole lot of difference how old it is, as long as you believe that God was there and God caused it. God was the uncaused cause. In fact, he was the uncaused cause of causes. That's what I hope to get across to you in this lesson, and I hope that you'll just open your heart and listen. I'm not going to tell you how I believe. And I'm only going to go to a certain extent to tell you how much I think you should believe. And I'll say that up front. Go ahead and have your conviction. But this is not a matter of fellowship. God is not going to keep you out of heaven because you answered this question wrong. I want us to concentrate for a few minutes on this passage. When King David chose his counselors and his warriors, his war council, his cabinet, his chiefs, one of the sections of people that he chose was from Issachar. And it says in 1 Chronicles 12 that he chose men of Issachar, men who had an understanding of the times to know what Israel should do. 200 chiefs. So these men had two qualifications. One of the qualifications was they should know the times and then also know what Israel should do. So more and more in our churches, we really need to know how to navigate these very turbulent times that we're in and know what the church should do in these times. If ever there was a passage for our day, this is it. So let's look at some of the different Christian approaches. That is, approaches in regard to what we're talking about here, apologetics, and right now the existence of God. You have two basic beliefs here. You have the New Earth creationists and the Old Earth creationists. New Earth creationists are those who believe that within a literal week, that is a 7-day span, that God literally created the earth in 6 literal 24-hour days. And those were consecutive days. So that within 1 week, God literally created the heavens and the earth. The second group that we have are what's called the Old Earth creationists, and there's a lot of divisions within that group. That group, many of them believe that the earth is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And depending on the version of belief that they have, it will tell you how old they think the earth is. But I want to tell you, and this is a fabulous book by Hugh Ross. It's called Resolving the Creation Controversy, A Matter of Days. I encourage you to get this book if you can. Hugh Ross was at a convention of Old Earth creationists. This is Christians. These are people who believe in God. And he said this was a conference primarily for Old Earth creationists, that the earth was created. And he discovered, to his surprise, that they had a couple of things in common. One is both young Earth and Old Earth creationists agree. Number one, God was directly involved in the creation of Adam and Eve. And number two, both groups upheld the biblical inerrancy and supernaturalism of the Christian belief. So it's a little difficult to know what we're arguing about here. I once heard an old Earth creationist being asked in a debate by a new Earth creationist. He said, "Do you not believe that God could create the Earth in 6 days?" And the old Earth creationist responded in this way: "No, I believe he could have created in 6 seconds if he wanted to." The question is not whether he could do it. The question is really looking back and is trying to determine how he did it. One of the things we have to look at here is truth. Truth is under assault in our culture today, and I'm sure you have definitely noticed that. If you watch the evening news at all, you know that that is the case. I like this passage in our textbook, Know What You Believe, where Paul Little says, "No one can rerun the beginning of the universe, or bring Napoleon back, or repeat the assassination of Lincoln, or the crucifixion of Jesus Christ." The fact that these events can't be proved by repetition does not disprove their reality as events. Empirical truth is truth that is verifiable, that you can put in a test tube and calculate the percentage of the ingredients involved and the chemicals that are involved and specific weights that are involved. That's empirical truth. But there's another kind of truth. Now, I'm not saying there's two truths. There's only one truth. But there's another way to get at truth. You can't put Abraham Lincoln or Napoleon in a test tube. We can't rerun history for the assassination of Julius Caesar or bring back Napoleon. You have to use other ways of determining whether or not these were true figures in history. And so that's another way to get at truth. It's not empirical, and I'm just going to use the term non-empirical, although there are a lot of fancier terms that we could use with that. For example, a priori versus a posteriori and things like that. But I think for the purposes of this class, empirical and non-empirical will do. You can't arrive at certain issues empirically. You have to arrive at those issues in order to ascertain truth in a non-empirical way. I like and am intrigued by this ontological argument that Paul Little brings up. He says, Augustine concluded, "Our hearts are restless until they find rest in thee." And he goes on to say, "The evidence shows that the vast majority of humanity at all times and in all places has believed in some kind of God or gods." What is there about human beings that is an innate desire to connect with something transcendent to them, a deity, a god, gods, whatever? Everywhere we've always had that. Descartes, one of my favorite philosophers, he said, "I think, therefore I am." I like that statement, and I wish we had more time to spend on that, because the whole process of thought, especially in postmodern times, is really something to be considered here. So he says, "I think, therefore I am." It's cogito ergo sum. That's the Latin. Sometimes you'll also see it in the French, je pense donc je suis, which means the same thing. I think, therefore I am. And a lot of times when that's presented, even in English literature, it's presented in the Latin or the French. But I want to introduce you to a person who used Descartes as a launching pad. It's Hunter Guthrie, an American priest. And he took the cogito ergo sum and he replaced it with inquietus ergo sum, which translated means I am restless, therefore I am. Restlessness is innate to humanity. Why are we restless? Another way you could translate this with a little loose, a little bit, playing a little loose with the translation, say, I hurt, therefore I am. All of us know pain, whether it's physical or emotional pain. Why is it that we have this structured within us to hurt, to grieve, to be lonely, to be depressed, to be discouraged? Inquietus ergo sum. I'm restless, therefore I am. Another belief is the cosmological belief. We're just touching on these very briefly. We can spend whole semesters on each one of these subjects, but we're just kind of going along with Paul Little's book, and this is the cosmological study. Now, here's what I want you to think about that word. The word has to do with the cosmos, cosmological. But if you just substitute that a little bit and use the word cause, C-A-U-S-E, cause, what caused the universe to come into being? God, the creator, the beginner, by definition, is eternal. He is uncreated. He is self-existent. Were God a created being, he could not be a cause. He would be an effect. He then could not be God. Paul Little's really onto something with that statement here. Thomas Aquinas said something very similar to this, talking about God being the uncaused cause. Another way to look at that is the uncaused cause of causes. Let's go back to Foundational Philosophy 101. Everything comes from something. That hasn't always been believed in history. Aristotle thought everything in the universe is infinite. But since the modern days of science, we prove that to be inaccurate. Everything comes from something, and nothing can come from nothing. But there are physical things, objects, and beings. They could not have come from nothing. They must have come from something eternal. Now, when we say that there used to be this belief that all things were eternal, and what they were meaning by that is all physical things, all particles were eternal. That's wrong. But there is something that is eternal, and that is the spiritual energy that we call God, who has a personality and a desire for relationship, and he's been through eternity the uncaused cause and the unmoved mover. Some have looked at this as if particles, that is, physical particles, have this eternal being. Look at this, what Little says. He says, scientists have long relied on infinite time plus chance to explain the origin of life. Now they're talking about physical things here. The view for them avoids the unacceptable conclusion of a divine cause. The process itself requires certain presuppositions and conditions, or else no life would generate. There must have been something before there were physical things. Nietzsche, who wasn't the first to declare God as dead, but he was certainly the one who articulated it in a way that got everybody's attention. And he had this theory. I'm going to just name the theory. I don't think there was a name to it. Duplicated reparticularization. That since there are only so many particles in the universe, physical particles, atoms, the electrons, neutrons, protons, quarks, flavors, strings, all of those things, and there are only so many of those, and they are eternal, if you accept that, which I don't. He says, if that's the case, that they are eternal, then we'll be back. Sometime in the far distant future, we'll all be back as who we are now. Because according to Nietzsche, in the same way that you would shuffle a deck of cards, if you shuffle that deck of cards enough times, an infinite amount of times, at some point, that deck of cards is going to be arranged in sequence exactly like the sequence was when you first started with the deck and then began shuffling it. Well, then there is the theological argument. All of these arguments we're looking at very quickly. We talked about this one a little bit last week. It's interesting here, Paul Little says, even Darwin himself, in a chapter from his Origin of the Species titled Difficulties with the Theory, he states, to suppose that the eye, with so many parts all working together, could have formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, Darwin said, absurd in the highest degree. Well, that then is the theory. This was not really Darwin's theory, but it was a theory that was being floated around Darwin's time called the survival of the fittest. Our question here that we're dealing with more is not the survival of the fittest, but the arrival of the fittest. Darwin leaned more to a term called natural selection, which was not original with him, but it's one we'll talk more about in future videos. The idea here is, as we've just talked about, if it is true that there is only a certain number of particles in the universe, and all of us, everything is made up of particles. You are, I am, the computer I'm recording onto is, the room I'm in is everything. And if there's only a certain number of particles in the world, but there is infinite time, at some point in time, all those particles are going to come back and be in the exact same structure and organization that they are in right now. The second law of thermodynamics, though, which talks about the law of entropy, is very interesting, though, because it says everything's going down. Darwin's evolution says everything's evolving to a higher order. The second law of thermodynamics says everything is devolving. Now, you can read a lot of this again in Hugh Ross's book, A Matter of Days. I will tell you, folks, I believe that it takes a whole lot more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a theist.